Welcome back to Obscure Chronicle. Tonight, we step into the shadowed corners of feudal Japan, where hidden whispers and quiet rituals unfold. In this episode, we'll drift through the silken halls of the Uku, the Shogun's inner palace, where concubines once moved like shadows in a world defined by subtle power and intricate social games. Close your eyes. Let the calm of this world ease over you as we explore the quiet life of those who lived behind paper walls, their voices softened by time and distance. Let the ebb and flow of history carry you gently to a place where, perhaps, the past and the present are not so far apart. As always, if you find yourself getting pulled into the story, give the video a like and subscribe, only if it feels right. And let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, open a window, and let's take this journey together. The ox cart creaked over the gravel path, its wheels muffled by straw. Within, beneath a bamboo curtain, a young woman sat in stillness, her posture perfect despite the long journey from her village. Her name was Kyo, though soon few would call her that. Once she crossed through the lacquered gates of Edo Castle, she would become one of many, another ripple in the silent pond of the Uku, the Shogun's inner palace of women. Outside, the sun sank into a slow golden hush. Temple bells rang distantly, signalling the hour of the monkey just before twilight. A breeze swept through the rows of pine that flanked the wide estate road, their needles whispering over centuries of dust. Kyo could smell it. The incense burned in distant halls, the perfume of peonies arranged by unseen hands, and the sharp, metallic scent of the city's moat. She was not yet 16. Her family had sent her with pride and fear. It was an honor, of course, to be selected by a local lord for recommendation. The Tokugawa court was meticulous in its choosing. Girls of good health, quiet bearing, refined manners. Beauty, certainly, but more than that. Obedience. The kind of beauty that bowed. She had not spoken since morning as instructed. Silence was one of the gates she would pass through. The others were physical, a series of thresholds, each more ornate, each guarded not just by men with spears, but by glances from women dressed in silk, whose eyes flicked over every movement. The Uku, she had heard, was not simply a harem. It was a world unto itself, nearly 1,000 women at its height, all living behind the layered doors of the Shogun's great fortress. Some were concubines, others were attendants, stewards, scholars of etiquette, or older women who managed the complex ecosystem of rank and rivalry. Kyo was to begin at the bottom. She remembered the parting instructions from her mother, whispered just before the ox cart departed. Do not think of your name. Do not think of your past. There are walls now where your thoughts must live. And so, for hours, she had thought only of clouds, the sky over the road, the shapes of her breath on the silk fan held against her mouth. Now the wheels slowed. The cart came to a halt beneath a tall wooden gate painted black and red. A servant stepped forward and opened the screen. She stepped out carefully, lowering her eyes, as she had been taught. There were no men here, only older women in layered robes, who regarded her like a vase brought in for cataloguing. She was not bowed to, she was assessed. No words were spoken. One of them, wearing 5 layers of indigo and ash-coloured silk, gestured with 2 fingers. Kyo followed. They passed through a set of rooms connected by sliding screens. Tatami mats beneath her feet absorbed the soft fall of her steps. Paper walls diffused the lantern light, casting ghost-like silhouettes of other women moving behind them. It was a maze made of silence and slow breath. She was shown to a small room with nothing but a pillow, a basin of water, and a folded kimono. The older woman who had led her in finally spoke, her voice gravel-thin. "Remove your travel robe, Washington. This evening, you're presented." The door slid shut. Alone, Kyo undressed in silence. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of transformation. She was no longer of the outer world. Here, within the walls of the Shogun's domain, she was a reflection of ceremony itself. She bathed her face with water from the porcelain bowl, wiping the dust of the road from her skin. Then she unfolded the robe laid out for her. Pale lavender silk, embroidered with threads so fine they looked like mist woven into fabric. It bore no crest. She had no family here, no name to stitch upon her sleeve. When the lanterns outside were lit, she was led down a covered corridor to a larger hall. The air smelled of pine and powdered sandalwood. Every breath carried the weight of centuries. Women before her, their footsteps worn into the grain of the wood, their laughter and tears absorbed by the paper screens. The room she entered was arranged in a crescent, with several other women seated quietly, their hands folded in their laps. At the centre, slightly elevated, sat a woman in her 60s, regal in the red and gold of a senior attendant. She was known as the Yoro Otodo, the highest-ranking lady-in-waiting. She spoke not to Kyo directly, but about her to no one in particular. "This one is from Sagami Province, daughter of a merchant, composed posture, hands like still water. We shall call her Asayo." A new name, given not by family but by order. Asayo bowed low, forehead to tatami. She was no longer a girl of the village. She was a shadow inside the palace walls. From now on she would rise before dawn, learn the language of glance and gesture, bow when spoken to, and offer silence as her safest reply. She would be trained in poetry, in the arrangement of incense, in the folding of letters, and in the art of walking without sound. And perhaps someday she would be summoned to the Shogun's chambers. But for now, she knelt, still, breathing in the rhythm of the palace. Outside, the cicadas had quieted. A bell rang once somewhere in the distance. In the uku, it was always evening. Beneath the tiled eaves of Edo Castle, past gates that no commoner could pass, lay a world few would ever see. The uku, literally great interior, was the hidden women's quarters of the Tokugawa shogunate, constructed in the early 1600s and maintained in secrecy and splendor for over 2 centuries. At its height, it held nearly 1,000 women, all carefully selected, all cloistered behind screens and rules, silence and silk. It was not merely a harem, but a court within a court, with its own hierarchy, its own rituals, and its own political gravity. No man, not even the shogun's closest advisors, could enter without express permission. The only man who walked its halls freely was the shogun himself. The women came from many paths. Some were daughters of samurai families or merchant houses, offered up as tokens of allegiance. Others were selected for their beauty, intellect, or grace by powerful patrons. Each one relinquished her name, her family, and her past at the gate. In return, she entered a world of strict refinement, where movement was art, silence was power, and memory became something folded carefully away like an old kimono. Rank governed everything. At the summit stood the Joro Otodo, the senior lady-in-waiting, who wielded influence not only over the women beneath her, but over the shogun himself. Beneath her, a layered bureaucracy mimicked the structure of the larger castle, with deputy officials, stewards of clothing, keepers of rituals, and guardians of etiquette. The concubines, official or favoured, were far fewer, but carried both privilege and peril, for favour could shift as quickly as seasons. Life in the uku was ordered and ritualised. Mornings began in stillness, the soft patter of slippers on tatami, the measured brewing of tea, the folding and unfolding of screens. Meals were served with care, often by women of lower rank, each dish crafted to reflect the season. Communication relied on glances, bows, pauses. Gossip was an undercurrent, quiet and potent. Education was strict and layered. Girls studied poetry, painting, music, and the subtle arts of presence. They were trained to compose letters on thin mulberry paper with brushes so delicate that a single misstroke meant failure. They learned incense blending, calligraphy, and the performance of silence. But beneath all of it, beneath the perfume and poetry, was loneliness. The uku was not a prison, but nor was it free. Some women never left. Others aged within its walls, fading like old silk, never once seeing the outer gardens again. Friendships were cautious. Love, rarer still. The most intimate gesture between two women might be a moment of shared breath, hands brushing during the folding of linens. And yet, in their stillness, these women shaped history. Their influence over the Shogun, their whispers and letters could tilt the course of policy, favour, and ambition. Behind the veil of formality, the uku was a theatre of quiet power, a place where silence could shout, and where the turning of a sleeve might carry the weight of 100 intentions. To live there was to breathe centuries, and every breath was watched. It begins with footsteps, soft, deliberate, a procession across the woven tatami where every motion is rehearsed not for performance, but for precision. A turn of the wrist, a dip of the head, a breath, paused like a comma in the grammar of stillness. I rose before dawn, as always. A concubine's day does not belong to her, but to the rhythm of the uku, the great inner quarters where no man walks freely but one. We began with ablution, not in the crude way of buckets or rushing streams, but in silence. The wiping of the skin with linen soaked in chrysanthemum water, the smoothing of eyebrows, the anointing of wrists with oil distilled from camellia seeds. The air was cold, but we did not shiver. To shiver would be to break form, and form was everything. The sound of sliding paper doors echoed like waves in slow procession. Screens shifted, opening, closing, filtering light like veils between this world and the other. Our robes were chosen not by whim, but by season and symbolism. Mine today was soft lavender, embroidered with cranes in flight. It was not my favourite. I had no favourite. Favourites implied preference, and preference in the uku was dangerous. Meals were quiet affairs, bowls of pickled radish, steamed rice, broth so delicate it trembled. We sat in rows, careful not to allow our sleeves to drift too far, or our glances to linger. The older women rarely ate much. Power thinned appetite, or perhaps it was the other way around. Conversation, when permitted, was coded. A comment on the weather might mean something else entirely. A favour won or lost, a shift in rank, the fall of someone once unshakable. We learned to read these nuances as a courtier might read omens in a crow's flight, or a scroll's final brushstroke. In the afternoon came instruction, poetry, music, flower arranging. Today, we practiced incense. The room filled with smoke so light it curled like breath. We played the kodo, the way of incense, in which each of us tried to identify a specific blend of woods and spices, its lineage, its purity, its intent. I failed today, mistaking aloes wood for clove. The instructor did not scold. She simply moved on. No sound was wasted. Even our footsteps were a language. Flat-footed for haste, heel first for announcement, gliding when summoned the Shogun. Ah, the Shogun. He was a shadow to most of us, seen once, perhaps twice in a lifetime. Some were summoned more often, some never were. His favour was a shifting tide, and to dwell on it was to drown. Still, there were whispers of his voice, of his gaze, of the way he lingered in the garden near the red camellias. We passed these whispers like offerings, not for gossip's sake, but for meaning. If he liked camellias, would he favour one who embroidered them? If he had wept last week, should we perform a poem about longing? There were rumours of poisonings, of quiet exiles, of women who vanished after one misplaced sentence. But we never spoke of such things above a hush. The uku was built of quiet stone and softer daggers. At night, we walked the corridors like ghosts, our sleeves brushing against lacquered screens. The palace seemed to exhale in the dark. Paper lanterns glowed dimly, casting long shadows. The night watch called the hours in rhythmic chants, as if trying to keep time from unravelling. Some nights music drifted in, a shamisen played by an older woman whose name had long since been forgotten outside the walls. The notes were always melancholy, though no one called them sad. In the uku, emotion was not a thing displayed but stored, pressed between memory and duty, like petals in a forgotten book. I remember once, when I was younger, asking an elder, "Do you miss the outside?" She had smiled, but not at me. "There is no outside," she said. "Not any more. There is only what is behind the screen, and what lies in your breath." I still think of that some nights, when the wind rattles the paper walls like a distant festival I'll never attend. Here, behind the screens, time is folded, memory is ritual, and the world is made of footsteps, silk and silence. Behind the great walls of Edo Castle, far from the battlefields and bureaucracies of shogunate politics, there existed a world governed not by swords, but by glances, etiquette, and unspoken hierarchies. This was the uku, literally the great interior, the secluded women's quarters of the Tokugawa shoguns, and one of the most complex social ecosystems of feudal Japan. While it may seem, at first glance, like a realm of refined leisure or delicate idleness, the truth was far more intricate. The uku was a place of enforced isolation and concentrated power, where hundreds of women, from elite noble-born ladies to servants and entertainers, lived under strict rules, rigid hierarchy, and constant surveillance. At its peak, the uku housed up to 3,000 women, though only a select few ever laid eyes on the shogun himself. And yet, paradoxically, many of these women wielded immense influence behind the scenes. Some served as intermediaries, some as confidants. A few, like the powerful Tenshoin, became political players capable of steering the very future of the Tokugawa dynasty. The structure within the uku was arranged with architectural precision to reflect its internal hierarchy. Closer to the shogun's chambers lived the Joro Otoshiori, senior lady-in-waiting, who functioned like a prime minister of the inner court. Beneath her were women of varying rank: churo, middle-ranking attendants; shoro, junior attendants or younger women in training; gomonin, elite women from samurai families, often trained in etiquette, calligraphy, and poetry; nakashozoku, the concubines of the shogun, carefully selected for beauty, intelligence, and political usefulness. Though male presence was strictly limited, and the shogun himself visited rarely, his role as the centre of gravity shaped every interaction. A single night of favour could elevate a woman or destroy her. rules and rituals, life in the uku was governed by a dense web of customs. Women entered as early as age 7, often selected from noble or samurai families, and were expected to live a life of cloistered devotion. They were not allowed to leave the uku without express permission, and the penalty for unauthorized contact with men was death, by execution or enforced suicide. Each woman was trained in walking, speaking, kneeling, pouring tea, dressing, and even how to react with controlled grace if the shogun approached. Education was emphasized with skills like poetry, incense appreciation, kodo, flower arrangement, ikebana, and classical literature being part of daily training. Yet for all its aesthetics, the uku was not an ideal. It was a pressure cooker of political tension, hidden alliances, and strategic survival. The women lived in a world where everything had meaning. The way one bowed, the length of one's sleeves, even the pattern on one's kimono could signal submission, alliance, or ambition. Many women were deeply devout, turning to Buddhism for comfort or practicing quiet rituals of Shinto purification in hopes of spiritual balance amid the tension. The shogun, a man who ruled over an entire nation, remained largely a mystery to most inside the uku. He was seen not as a person, but as an axis around which fortunes spun. A summons to his chambers could be a moment of triumph, or the beginning of quiet erasure. Even his appearance was controlled. Some concubines were selected to ensure political alliances with powerful clans, others as rewards to retainers. A select few became mothers to his children, although very few Tokugawa shoguns publicly acknowledged concubine-born sons, creating additional layers of intrigue. The shogun's emotional whims were dangerous currency. Favor could be won with a poem, a conversation, or a graceful gesture. It could also be lost for reasons no one dared question. A gilded cage. Despite the silks and serenity, the uku was, at heart, a prison of velvet and shadows. The outside world was glimpsed only through stories or stolen views as gardens. The seasons passed, marked by ceremonial changes in clothing, or incense rather than winds or weather, and yet many women adjusted. Some found solace in spiritual practice, others forged alliances, a few rose to real power, most simply endured. It is tempting to see the women of the uku as passive figures in a male-dominated world, but the truth is more complex. They were strategists, poets, survivors. They navigated one of the most intricate power structures in pre-modern Japan, where every movement was a message and silence was a kind of shield. In the hush of tatami and the whisper of silk, they lived lives largely unwritten, but no less real for their invisibility. The uku is a world shaped by invisible threads, of rank, of ritual, of rivalry, woven as tightly as the seams of a kimono. Behind the lacquered walls and brocade curtains, each woman moves through a hierarchy as delicate and dangerous as a spider's web. We do not speak of power here in open voice, but it lingers in every glance, every perfume choice, every practiced bow. No one enters this place without a designation. You're not merely a woman, you're a position. At the lowest rung are the kamuro, the young girls brought in from good families to serve and be trained. Their days are filled with lessons, errand running, and wide-eyed wonder. Some cling to one another like sparrows in winter. Others burn with ambition already. We watch them. We all did once. Above them, the junior attendants called Nyobo run the daily machinery of our hidden city, preparing the bathing waters, folding the silk robes, managing the inventory of incense and cosmetics, keeping time with whispered bells. They bow quickly, eyes lowered, their names half remembered unless they err or rise. Then come the maidens of service, each under the eye of a higher-ranked mistress. These women wear finer robes, walk with slower grace, and are allowed to speak in the presence of their superiors, if only in soft syllables. They begin to carry the scent of privilege, faint as plum blossom on the wind. Above them are the official concubines, those chosen to possibly bear the shogun's child. They do not clean. They do not kneel unless before the highest ranked. Their names are known. Their rivals are many, and their time in the shogun's chamber becomes both currency and curse. I have not yet reached that tier. There is the Mide Dokoro, the legal wife of the shogun, though rarely seen within the uku. Her position is ceremonial, prestigious, and often lonely, a flower trapped in gold. Though she reigns over us in name, it is the Joro Otoshiori, the senior lady, who rules in practice. The Joro's presence is never accidental. She appears like moonlight on polished stone, pale, cold, mesmerizing. Her robes are darker than ours, embroidered with cranes and waves. She knows every secret carried by the wind between paper walls. She speaks only when silence has made its point, and when she nods to a concubine, it is either anointing or omen. Rivalries run beneath this surface, silent rivers that erode without noise. There are glances sharpened like needles, whispered alliances formed during tea, a misplaced robe, a misdelivered note, a rumour born like mist and just as difficult to grasp. I have learned not to trust the perfume of roses. It often masks poison. One girl, Hanae, once laughed too openly in the Joro's presence. She was reassigned to laundry duty, a fate worse than banishment. Another, discreet and plain, now wears crimson silk and speaks directly to the shogun. No one knows why. We simply bow and call her Lady Sora, and do not look too long. We're not permitted mirrors in our rooms, lest vanity sprout where humility should grow. But every woman in the uku reflects her rank in 1,000 other ways. The thickness of her obi, the length of her sleeves, the ingredients in her tea. I have seen women argue silently through the order of footsteps. It is not just the shogun we serve. It is the art of knowing one's place. And yet, in the smallest corners, between lessons in shared glances beneath shared blankets and cold nights, bonds form, fragile, flickering. A laugh shared over a clumsy bow, a whispered poem passed in folded paper, moments of humanity beneath the lacquer. Even in the most ordered garden, wild petals find a way to bloom. The uku, da'o, or great interior, was the secluded women's quarters of Edo Castle, established during the reign of Tokugawa Iemitsu in the 17th century. Designed as a strictly hierarchical inner sanctum, the uku was both a gilded cage and a political instrument of the Tokugawa shogunate. At its height, the uku housed up to 3,000 women, including concubines, maids, administrators, and officials. Every woman within these walls served the shogun in some form, be it directly through ritual or by ensuring the seamless, invisible flow of life within Edo Castle. The uku was isolated from the outside world. Men were strictly forbidden except for the shogun and a few high-ranking physicians or officials under tightly controlled circumstances. Hierarchy within the uku was rigid, dictated by rules as codified as any military system. Titles included Joro Otoshiori, Senior Lady, the highest-ranking woman, essentially the Prime Minister of the uku, often older and politically astute, Churo and Nakaoku, mid-level attendants or supervisors, Kosho, junior attendants, often teenagers from samurai families, Joro, courtesans and concubines, Kamuro, child servants or apprentices. Promotion often depended on personal favour, lineage, or alliances within this closed society. Ambition, while discreet, could be potent, and rivalries were real. Despite its isolation, the uku became a microcosm of Edo society, influencing fashion, literature, and courtly etiquette. Women of the uku read poetry, played music, maintained religious altars, and wrote letters, sometimes in secret. Politics, rumours, and intrigue were the invisible ink of everyday life. Interestingly, these women, even when unseen by the public, shaped the image and tastes of the elite. The uku, for all its isolation, was a place where whispers became winds, and the fate of even the shogun could begin with a bowed head or a painted fan. Within the refined interior of the uku, language was not always spoken. Every object, every gesture, every arrangement of colour or fragrance carried meaning. A long-sleeved kimono, furisode, implied youth or unwed status. A crimson inner lining might suggest favour from the shogun, or rumours of it. Women wore different hair arrangements based on their status. Even the height of a comb or the position of a hairpin could betray hidden messages. Scent, in particular, was a vital tool of subtle court rivalry and intimacy. Blends of incense and perfume, called kodo, were custom formulated for each woman. Some wore the earthy warmth of aga wood, others the floral sharpness of plum blossom. A misplaced scent on one's robe could indicate secret contact, or an intentional accusation. Fans were another form of quiet communication. The angle of an open fan while seated, a deliberate flick of the wrist, the pace of folding, all told stories. Lovers communicated with fans in poetry contests, rivals with veiled sarcasm. Letters passed within the uku were written on washi paper soaked in plum or chrysanthemum water, perfumed and carefully folded. Some were shaped into cranes, turtles, or stars, depending on season or sentiment. A single kanji could destroy a reputation, or save it. This realm of women was a theatre of elegance and danger, played in silence, lit by candlelight and perfumed secrets. The very art of survival in the uku was to speak without words, to rise without stepping, and to love without expecting. The evening arrives with a hush so complete it could be mistaken for reverence. Within the innermost walls of Edo Castle, lanterns glow like quiet stars behind screens of rice paper. Every shadow lengthens with purpose. Every movement is rehearsed, yet trembling with consequence. Tonight is one of the rare nights when a concubine may be summoned to the shogun. To be seen, truly seen by the shogun is not a casual affair. It is an intersection of months of silent preparation, political currents beyond one's sight, and the ungraspable whim of power. For the women of the uku, it is not merely a visit, it is a shift in gravity. The summons does not come in voice, but on parchment, crisp, delicately inked, carried by a senior attendant in layered robes of deep plum. A name, written in kanji so precise it seems to float. There are no instructions, only expectation. The chosen woman bows in silence, her attendants already moving to prepare. She is bathed not by herself, but by practiced hands who know how to scrub the day's breath from the skin without bruising the ritual. Scented water laced with camellia and lotus, hair unbound, brushed until it flows like ink in water, and then bound again, high and tight, symbolic of availability and dignity. She wears silk that is not chosen by her but by custom. Layers of symbolism wrapped into each fold, red for fertility, white for renewal, lavender for calm submission. Even her footsteps are chosen, which pair of lacquered slippers to wear, how they will sound against polished wood. And so she walks the corridor, flanked by silence, shadow, and the soft rustle of robes behind her. The shogun's private chamber is screened in cedar and gold. A faint incense burns in the brazier, sandalwood mixed with something more elusive, perhaps the memory of winter. He waits not behind a throne, but seated simply, robes wide, posture effortless. It is not uncommon for him to say little or nothing. The room itself speaks in his stead. The woman bows low and long until her forehead nearly touches the tatami mat. She remains until acknowledged, not by speech, but a tilt of the fan in his hand. The air is still. The eyes of servants and guards remain respectfully turned away, but their ears are trained for breath, for stillness broken. Sometimes there are words exchanged, polite, measured. She may be asked to recite a poem, to sing a single verse, or pour tea with a hand that does not shake. The encounter is never spontaneous. It is choreographed ambiguity, at once intimate and distant, charged and unreadable. He may ask about her hometown. He may not ask anything at all. His gaze may linger on the nape of her neck, exposed beneath the fall of her hair, considered the most sensual part of a woman in this time, more so than lips or eyes. For her there is no guarantee of future summons, no promise of favour. A single night may alter the tides of her standing in the uku, or pass like fog without notice. The shogun, though powerful, is also a man shaped by court expectations, ceremonial duty, and the weight of legacy. His gaze is not entirely his own, shaped by politics, advisors, omens, and unseen decisions. When she is dismissed, if she is dismissed, it is with the same quiet formality. A nod, a shift in breath. She leaves the room slowly, never turning her back. Only once outside the chamber does she exhale fully, and even then she will not speak. Other women may wait in corridors. Some may offer respectful glances. Others might glance too long. Everything is seen, even if it is not acknowledged. For now she returns to her chamber, alone, unknowing, both elevated and vulnerable. Later the women of the uku will speculate. There will be silences louder than any words. The perfume she wore will be noted, the shade of her robe, whether the brazier burned too hot or not at all. And somewhere the shogun may remember her, or not. In this world of silken shadows and ceremonial firelight, a single night beneath the shogun's gaze may echo for years, or disappear like breath on a mirror. Though the shogun ruled from behind veils of formality and lacquered wood, his figure stood astride myth and statecraft alike. To the women in the inner chambers, and to the whispering masses beyond the castle gates, he was not merely a man. He was a dreamer, a receiver of omens, a blade that spoke with the voice of heaven. The word shogun, short for Sei Taishogun, Gengi Dajiangjun, translates to commander-in-chief of the expeditionary force against the barbarians. Yet over the centuries the meaning transcended the battlefield. The shogun became the silent emperor of reality, ruling in all but name, while the figurehead emperor in Kyoto remained enshrined in sacred silence. It is said that dreams haunted more than one shogun. In Edo period chronicles there are references to Tokugawa Ieyasu, founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, experiencing a sequence of visions following his unification of Japan. Monks in his court wrote of one dream in particular: a white fox seated upon a red gate, whispering secrets in archaic Chinese. Interpreters declared the fox a messenger from Inari, god of grain and strategy. The next day, Ieyasu altered a military campaign, avoiding a route that would have led to ambush. Whether this tale is truth or embroidery, It was retold in secret by servants as proof. The Shogun sees what others cannot. Another tale clings to Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, an earlier shogun of the 14th century who built the Golden Pavilion of Kyoto. It is said he once dreamed of standing on a mountain of gold, while a crane sang the names of all the women he would love. He awoke and ordered the pavilion's roof gilded, claiming it would protect the nation's soul. Whether this dream was divine, self-indulgent, or state propaganda is lost in the folds of history. Dreams were more than inner musings. They were used to shape policy, justify marriages, and purge rivals. A dream seen by the shogun could become law. But it was not always the shogun who dreamt. Often it was a monk, a concubine, or even a favoured falconer whose dream would be received and interpreted as divine truth, filtered through the shogun's authority. In many castle chronicles there were records of dream readers, ascetic priests trained in yoniromancy, the art of dream interpretation. They would fast for days before divining the meaning of a leader's vision. If a dream was bad, it might be buried by writing it on mulberry paper and floating it down a sacred river. If it was good, it was woven into the political tapestry of the time, used to justify a new edict or war. Among the women of the Uku, too, dreams carried weight. It was whispered that a concubine who dreamed of a dragon coiled beneath moonlight would rise in favour. Another rumour told of a lady who dreamt of a paper lantern that would not go out in the rain, and later gave birth to a shogun's son said to be untouchable by misfortune. The shogun's own dreams, of course, were rarely spoken aloud. They were guarded, written in obscure diaries, or burned upon waking. In a time when divine signs mattered more than written law, a dream could kill or crown. But behind all the myths, behind the lacquered mask of power, lay a deeper truth. The shogun was human. He too feared betrayal. He too lay awake at night, haunted by the future, by ancestors, by duties heavier than armour. A ruler's mind was never still. In the rare stillness of night, with only the sigh of the wind against cedar beams, it's easy to imagine him there, the shogun, seated upright, eyes closed, listening not for footsteps, but for the echo of something older, a whisper, a scent, a dream. And in the soft silence that follows, the weight of empire settles like a blanket of snow. They say she came to Edo with nothing but a comb made of peachwood and a lantern that would not go out. Her name is lost now. Some say it was Aki, others Hoshiko. In the shoji-shadowed corners of the Uku, the tale survives only as the Lantern Maiden. She was not from noble birth, only the daughter of a low-ranked shrine keeper far to the north. But when the shogun's procession passed her village, his gaze caught hers, or so the story goes. She did not bow low enough, or perhaps she bowed just so, as though offering her breath, but not her soul. Weeks later, she was summoned, entered the Uku behind lacquered doors that shut like fate. The other women mocked her. She had no court polish, no family name, no skill in poetry. But at night, she lit her strange paper lantern, and it never went out, even in storm, even in wind, even when one of the senior ladies tried to snuff it while she bathed. They whispered, she is favoured by the kitsune. Or worse, she brought fire spirits in her sleeves. But what frightened them more was her silence. Then came the dream. One night she woke screaming, unheard in the great hush of the Uku. She was found sitting upright in her sleeping mat, hair loose, hands cold. She spoke of a dream, a red carp swimming in a dry river, surrounded by cranes who would not fly. She claimed the carp spoke her name. The dream spread like ink. Some said it was an omen, others that she had gone mad. But 3 days later, a message came from the upper palace. The Shogun would see her. He had not summoned any woman from the Uku in weeks. What they spoke of no one knows. Some claim she wept at his feet. Others insist she handed him the peachwood comb and told him of the carp's words. But he let her stay, not as concubine, not as lady, but as keeper of lamps, a role not seen in generations. And in the years that followed, on nights when the winds howled and the castle shivered, the Shogun would call for her. She would come, silent as a fallen sleeve, and light his way with the flame that never died. When she passed away, some say quietly, others say in a blaze, the Shogun ordered her lantern buried at the foot of Mount Fuji, wrapped in silk, bound with red thread, a lantern that no one could ever extinguish. Even now, some say, if you walk the pine paths in spring and the fog rises just so, you may glimpse her, a pale figure, lantern in hand. And if you follow the light, you will not dream that night, but you will wake with the faint scent of peach blossom and ash. It is not always poison or favour that kills in the Uku. Sometimes it is a name, a single name written on silk. They say it happened during the reign of the 7th Shogun. No one remembers his face, but all remember her, Lady Rin, called the Quiet Brush. She was not the most beautiful, nor the most skilled in song, but she wrote poetry that could make even the stone lanterns weep dew. It was her calligraphy that was her gift, or her curse. She could draw a single character and change a man's heart, or so they said. The tale was passed from maid to maid, whispered during hair combing, between bites of plum, when the shadows were long and soft. They said she once wrote a love poem for a maid who could not speak, and days later, the maid found herself summoned by a visiting daimyo who claimed to have dreamt her face. But Rin was careful, too careful. She did not love the Shogun. That was known, and yet he favoured her, called for her presence not for touch, but for ink. She wrote him lines of moonlight and moss, of crows that remembered the names of kings, of rivers that could not forget. One morning, the senior lady found a small poem tucked under her pillow, written in Rin's unmistakable hand. It said, "You move like an eel through court water, but the sea does not forget the stone." That night, Rin was accused of sorcery. They searched her rooms and found a brush still moving, writing by itself. Of course, that part is surely myth. Or so we tell ourselves. They say she smiled when they exiled her. Smiled and whispered, "The ink remembers more than you think." The next year, the Shogun fell ill. His voice vanished. He could no longer sign his name. Some say his tongue had turned to parchment. And somewhere, locked in a lacquered drawer, is a poem that writes itself anew every spring, one word at a time, in a hand long gone, with ink that smells faintly of plum blossom and regret. They say if you read it backwards, it spells out a name you dare not speak. But we don't believe in such things. We are proper women. We bow. We smile. We speak only when spoken to. And we never ever touch the old brushes in the storehouse, not even during plum rain. The Uku was no idle garden of ornament. Beneath the layers of brocade and obedience, it was a place of learning, deliberate, refined, and saturated with the quiet rituals of cultivation. For a concubine to rise, or even remain, she had to be not merely beautiful, but artful. Even before one glimpsed the shadow of power, there was the scroll and the stringed instrument, the seasonal ink stone and the hourglass of study. Refinement was currency, and every stroke of a brush could spell favour or forgetfulness. The day would begin not with fanfare, but with silence. Servants drew open latticed screens just enough to let in the pale morning light. The fragrance of pine and chrysanthemum wafted from warmed cloths as the women sat in straight-backed poise, awaiting instruction. Today, calligraphy. The master's voice was soft, almost background to the scratching of brushes across fine mulberry paper. The character for snow was practiced over and over. The silence was not empty, it pulsed with breath, with the weight of comparison, with the sting of perfection pursued endlessly. "Your yuki is heavy," the tutor whispered to one young woman. "Snow falls lighter than that. Let the brush carry air." Even snow had rules in this place. At mid-morning the room changed. The koto was unwrapped like a sacred object, its lacquered wood gleaming like ink under moonlight. Fingers were cleaned with rice water and dabbed in camellia oil before they were allowed to pluck its silk strings. Each sound had its own season, one scale for summer heat, another for early frost. Music was not played, it was breathed. A woman did not simply perform, she embodied. By afternoon they recited poetry, from memory. Not just the lines, but the tones and the proper pauses, the restrained rise of the voice on a cherry blossom syllable, the dignified stillness after the last word. Seasonal references were studied like scripture. Cranes for winter, cicadas for regret, plum for resilience, and river mist for things lost. Each metaphor, a secret key. Each poem, a doorway into emotion too delicate for speech. Occasionally, women were allowed to compose their own verses. These were rarely praised aloud, but the silence after a beautiful line was telling, like a held breath. The inkstone cooled. Before my thought reached paper, now autumn is gone. Very good, a mistress might say, but only if the line drew stillness across the room. Seasonal customs fill the interstices between lessons, lantern making in late summer, chrysanthemum arranging in early frost, the proper way to fold a kimono sleeve during setsubun. Every action reflected an inner virtue, restraint, clarity, obedience, and above all, awareness of fleeting beauty. And yet, behind this theatre of elegance, each lesson held another layer, strategy. To master the arts was not simply to please, it was to speak without words, to signal affection or ambition with the flick of a fan or the arc of a brush stroke. Refinement was language, a second voice that only those trained could hear. In the evenings, the women returned to their chambers with ink-stained sleeves and minds full of rhythm and metaphor. Candles flickered as they copied old verses by moonlight, hoping for the day their own words might reach a reading room far above, where the Shogun's attention floated like incense smoke. No scream or confrontation would ever shake the uku, but a poem, just one perfectly timed phrase, could. And in this, education became power, not loud, not spoken, but written in silence and bound in the soft chords of the mind. In Edo Japan, to understand beauty was to understand impermanence. The seasons were not merely measures of time, but rhythms of the soul, a sacred choreography that governed court life, poetry, clothing, scent, and the very pacing of a conversation. Everything was arranged not to resist time, but to flow within it. The Japanese aesthetic tradition of mono-no-aware, the awareness of the transience of things, was not sadness, but tenderness. It taught that the most beautiful things are those closest to passing. A falling cherry blossom, the last cicada call before frost, a poem written in late autumn when the wind carries more memory than sound. For the women of the uku, refinement was a kind of emotional architecture. It structured their days not only with tasks, but with meaning. Every seasonal festival they prepared for, every poem they learned by heart, every scent they dabbed behind the ear, it was all a conversation with time. Feminine accomplishment in this world was not loud nor linear. It did not resemble ambition in the Western sense. It was curved and subtle, held in the layers of silk, in the pause between musical notes, in a fan partially open to suggest emotion without naming it. This was not weakness, but artistry, and in this artistry, power lived. Calligraphy was not simply writing. It was a mirror to the soul, revealing temperament and poise. Music was not merely entertainment. It was a way of showing grace under pressure, of understanding harmony amid silence. Poetry was not idle diversion. It was the true voice of the heart trained to whisper what could not be shouted. In this garden of women, refinement was not escape. It was resilience. To survive the uku, to navigate its hierarchies and silences, one had to possess more than beauty. One had to read the language of autumn winds, hear meaning in the crack of incense, and carry within the poise of plum blossoms blooming against snow. And so, within painted screens and perfumed rooms, the women lived not just in space but in seasonal time. Cultivated, ephemeral, and inwardly fierce. Their elegance was not passivity. It was endurance disguised as grace. To wield a brush in Edo Japan was to hold a thread between worlds. Calligraphy, shodo, was far more than writing. It was considered a living embodiment of one's inner spirit, a trace of the heart left on paper. Each stroke, whether bold or feathered, carried the residue of thought, breath, and poise. For the concubines of the uku, trained from youth to perfection, calligraphy was both discipline and self-expression, one of the few places where emotion might be revealed without risk. Each morning began with the ritual of ink, a quiet hour grinding a black ink stick against stone, adding water drop by drop, until a perfect balance of fluidity and richness was achieved. In that slow circling of pigment and water, a form of meditation took root. It was not rushed. It could not be. Every part of the process mirrored the inner refinement expected of a woman in the inner chambers. Kanji characters were practiced like choreography. The downward stroke of kokoro, heart, the delicate hook in hana, flower, the breathing space within yugen, mysterious grace. They wrote poems in brushstrokes, letters in whispered formality, and names, both their own and others, with the reverence of someone holding a prayer. But the arts taught to the women of the uku extended beyond the brush. The koto, a long zither-like instrument, was taught with equal solemnity. The strings, plucked with ivory picks worn on 3 fingers, created sounds that echoed like rain across a still pond. It was said that a single well-played note on the koto could move the soul more than 100 spoken words. There were melodies for each season, airy scales for spring, melancholy tones for the ghost songs of autumn. Learning them was not optional. It was required that a lady of rank knew how to fill a room not with voice, but with resonance. Poetry, particularly waka and haiku, was a conversational tool as much as an art form. The women composed verses for celebrations, observations, and even rivalries, subtle barbs or affections hidden in floral metaphors and moonlit imagery. A well-turned phrase could elevate one's reputation. A clumsy one might expose vulnerability. Poems were recited aloud, but often passed quietly on folded slips of paper, placed between pages of books or beneath lacquered trays, secretive, ritualistic. And then there were the customs of scent, flower arrangement, ikebana, the folding of fans and the layering of kimono, an unspoken language all its own. To wear the wrong shade of plum in late winter was a minor disgrace. To reference the wrong festival season in a poem was a sign of poor breeding. Yet behind all of this elegance and precision lay something deeper, a coded resilience. For many women within the uku, the pursuit of artistic perfection was not simply for beauty or entertainment. It was a form of emotional survival, a place to channel sorrow, longing, and loneliness into refinement, into structure. A brush became a lifeline, a koto string, a whisper in the dark. Their arts were never just about skill. They were acts of grace under constraint, songs beneath silken layers, truths wrapped in metaphor. And when the lamps dimmed and the chambers hushed, the ink dried silently on paper, a soul crystallized into strokes, preserved like a pressed blossom for no one but the gods and time itself. Night falls not with noise, but with the slow drawing of a screen. Inside the moon pavilion, a smaller secluded chamber behind rows of carved wood and paper, the air grows warmer with candlelight. Shadows stretch long and slow across tatami mats. Lanterns flicker behind shoji, and distant echoes of laughter or conversation from other parts of the uku dissolve into hush. Here, in this intimate quiet, the rituals of evening begin. A concubine, unnamed, as they often are in history, kneels by her dressing stand. Her attendant, silent as a ghost, prepares a basin of warm water. Steam lifts in delicate wisps. The concubine's hair is brushed in long strokes, each movement like the passing of time itself. Her robes, day layers of formality and grandeur, are replaced by lighter silks, dyed with soft indigo or ochre, lined with faint floral patterns. Even at rest, beauty is demanded. But the moonlight offers a gentler standard. Outside, a sliver of the moon hangs low and pale over the courtyard stones. A night breeze threads through the wooden lattices. The courtyard's pond mirrors it, that drifting crescent, as if the sky has poured its silver into the earth. Within these hours, the palace becomes a liminal world, not quite asleep, not quite awake. The women of the uku do not gather loudly. Night encourages intimacy. Small whispered exchanges under shared quilts, laughter stifled behind sleeves, moments of solitude by the lantern's glow. Some write letters never to be sent. Others pray. Others watch the moon and wonder if it shines the same way in the village they once called home. Dreams here are sacred territory. It is believed that the shogun's favour could be hinted at in dreams, that a fox spirit or ghost might whisper a name to him while he slept, carried on smoke or song, and so incense is burned. Special mixtures, sandalwood, plum blossom or rare chiara, are chosen carefully, their scent said to guide sleep like a boat over water. Some women, those who dream deeply, keep journals hidden among their bedding, not of schemes or rivalry, but of visions, forests with speaking trees, ancestral mothers by rivers, or distant lovers walking path through mist. These are not shared aloud, but they shape the heart. The Moon Pavilion, though humble, has a history. It is said that one concubine who once slept here was visited each night by a nightingale that spoke prophecies in verse. Another claimed that her dreams predicted births and deaths within the court, until she vanished during one long winter. Even the architecture holds secrets. A panel behind the altar slides open to reveal a private garden, moonlit and overgrown, where lilies bloom out of season and the moss smells like cedar after rain. Some women come here barefoot late into the night, believing the silence is more honest than any chamber gossip. And when sleep finally arrives, it does so like silk slipping off a shoulder. The body curls beneath embroidered covers. The paper walls hum faintly in the wind. Somewhere, a koto note still rings in memory. The past and future lose their grip. Only the now remains. Warm breath, the rustle of linen, the scent of cherry bark, the half-formed image of someone's face smiling in the dark. Here, the night is not feared. It is held gently, understood. In the floating world of Edo period Japan, the night was not merely an absence of sunlight. It was its own realm, a time for poetry, intimacy, ritual, and revelation. And within the walls of elite quarters like the uku, the act of going to sleep became a deliberate art. Sleep in these times was structured, often ritualized, and deeply connected to notions of seasonal rhythm, bodily harmony, and spiritual openness. Bedding, futon and shikibutan, was carefully aired each morning and relayed each evening, ensuring softness and health. The placement of the bedding, the orientation of the head, the materials used were sometimes influenced by beliefs in feng shui or onmyodo, Japan's native esoteric cosmology. More than mere rest, sleep was a liminal practice, a drifting into another realm, one that might offer insight, omens, or visitations. Among both nobles and commoners, dreams were often recorded in diaries. A particularly vivid or disturbing dream might warrant a temple visit or an offering to pacify wandering spirits. In the uku, where a woman's fate could shift with a single glance, dreams might be studied for hidden meanings. A concubine dreaming of flowers blooming from stone or fireflies circling her bed might take it as a sign of favour or forewarning. Others feared dreams entirely, viewing them as entanglements with yokai or ancestral spirits. To soothe the spirit and guide sleep, women turned to incense, not merely for fragrance, but for spiritual and psychological balance. The most refined incense was made from agar wood, ginkgo, and sandalwood, blended with herbs, resins, and flowers, pressed into sticks or loose mixtures. The aristocracy practiced the art of kodo, the way of fragrance, where incense was not just burned, but listened to. The subtle changes in scent were said to evoke landscapes, memories, or seasons. In the uku, incense was also used for more personal spells, calming jealousies, inviting peaceful dreams, or honouring the moon. Some believed that a certain blend mixed with clove, cassia, and chrysanthemum would ensure that one's dreams would be remembered by the divine. The night then was layered. Women who appeared calm during the day might cry under the covers after the lamps were dimmed. Others might practice writing haiku by moonlight or trace poems in the air with their fingers. Even within a rigid structure, the hours after dusk allowed for a kind of freedom, of thought, of longing, of introspection. And perhaps that is why, in so many records and ghost stories of the Edo era, it is during sleep that the world shifts. Lovers meet, ancestors speak, truths are whispered, and sometimes the moon itself descends through the paper walls to rest beside a dreaming soul, listening in silence. There was a quiet girl in the uku whose name has vanished from the records. Perhaps she was called Yuki, Snow, for her silence. She did not rise to become a concubine or attendant of rank. She was what they called a Toro Mochi, a lantern keeper. Her job, humble as it was, carried a strange kind of power. Each evening, after the baths were drawn and the last bowls of rice cleared away, Yuki would move barefoot through the lacquered corridors, lighting the lanterns, one by one, first in the outer halls, then in the reading room, then slowly through the quarters of the women themselves. The uku was vast and after nightfall eerily silent. The only sounds were the whisper of silk sliding across floorboards and the click of her flint. The paper lanterns gave off a gentle glow, casting long shadows against the painted screens. Cranes in flight, pines in winter, lotus blooms drifting across golden panels. It was said that Yuki always paused at one particular door, that of Lady Matsue, a concubine of rare beauty who had died 2 years before. A fever, they whispered, or perhaps poison. No one was sure. Her room had been sealed, her silks burned, and yet each night Yuki stopped and bowed, as if the spirit within still demanded respect. Some of the other women noticed, some were unnerved. One autumn night, a curious attendant followed her. At the threshold of Lady Matsue's door, Yuki knelt, but she did not bow. She slid open a narrow panel and left a tiny bundle of incense sticks, sandalwood, plum blossom, and crushed chrysanthemum petals, a blend associated with mourning and memory. She whispered something into the darkness and stood still, eyes closed. The next morning, a slip of calligraphy was found tucked under a tea tray in the main chamber. It was written in a fine, elegant hand, and no one could agree whose it had been. In the halls where silence blooms, I light one lantern for the dead. She watches still, her dreams perfumed. A chill passed through the uku. Even the most rational among them admitted a strange stillness that night, as if Lady Matsue herself had walked again beneath the moon. Historically, such tales were not rare. Women of the uku often held secret rituals, little acts of remembrance for friends lost, sisters disgraced, or those who had vanished into sudden silence. Because their world was bounded by invisible walls, not just of architecture, but of propriety and power, grief had to find quiet exits. These tales, the haunted lantern, the ghostly poem, the scent left in empty chambers, were never recorded in the kanjo registers, but they passed mouth to ear, hand to hand, as enduring as the perfume of incense on silk. Whispers kept them alive, like flame in a windless room. In the secluded corner of the uku, beyond the main audience chamber, and hidden past a screen of white plum blossoms painted in ink, there stood a chamber left untouched, not forbidden, just forgotten. The women called it Utsushi no Ma, the Room of Reflections. It once belonged to a concubine named Lady Itsuki, favoured by a previous shogun not for her beauty, but for her uncanny mind. It was said she could recall entire poetry scrolls after one reading, and that she composed riddles that baffled even the court scholars. Her voice was low and melodic, rarely raised, and her presence, while soft, carried weight. Her nickname within the inner circle was Kagejo, the Shadow Lady. Itsuki's chambers were lined with mirrors, not many, but just a few large bronze-polished ones, burnished to such a deep sheen they seemed more like still pools than surfaces. Mirrors in the Edo period were rare and powerful objects, often associated with spirits, vanity, or the divine, a conduit between worlds. One night, Lady Itsuki vanished. There were rumours, a failed pregnancy, a political fall from grace, a poisoned dumpling. Some said she'd asked the mirror a question no one should ever ask. Others swore that on certain nights the maids found one mirror covered in frost even in midsummer. After her disappearance, the room was sealed. Yet from time to time, late at night, maids passing near it reported odd occurrences. The sound of someone softly humming a gagaku tune no one had sung in years, a poem written in fog on the glass, the scent of persimmon ink and burnt lacquer. Once the shoji screens were found cracked open just a hand's width, but there were no footprints. There was a tale among the youngest attendants that Lady Itsuki's soul had not been taken to Yomi, the underworld, but trapped between the layers of her mirror, and that if one entered the room and looked too long into the glass, they wouldn't see themselves at all. They would see her, not as she was, but as she had become, watchful, patient, and silent. A matron once bold dared the tale one night. She entered Utsushi no Ma by lantern light and stood before the central mirror. What she saw was debated. She never spoke of it. But she resigned the next day and shaved her head to enter a temple in Kofu. She refused silk, refused visitors, and spent her days in reflection, facing a wall. Of course, no such things are written in the formal records. The Uku Nikki contains no line for spirits or shadows, but the mirror was eventually removed, not destroyed, just stored, deep within the treasury archives, wrapped in red cloth sealed with rice paper and marked, "Do not polish." Even now, historians argue whether Lady Itsuki truly existed. Some say she was a composite of multiple women. Others insist she was just a tale made to scare junior attendants into obedience. But in the Uku, where memory wears a mask and time folds softly in on itself, truth and whisper are often one and the same. The gardens of the Uku stirred once more. It was early spring, and the cherry trees, planted in rows by generations of hands long turned to dust, had begun their annual ritual, the brief, breathtaking bloom of sakura. Their pale pink petals unfurled like sighs from the branches, trembling at the breath of wind, as if aware their moment was already fading. In the Uku, the inner chambers of Edo Castle, these blossoms were more than beauty. They were spectacle, a measured, poetic event carefully orchestrated by court ladies and attendants, many of whom had been planning this week for months. New kimono were selected, soft blues for those still hoping to catch the shogun's gaze, dusky purples for those with nothing to prove. Dyes drawn from safflower and indigo, carefully layered and pressed, moved across the garden like petals in human form. The Lady Overseer had declared the first blossom viewing on the 6th day of the 3rd month. A scroll in the common wing read simply, "Be still and watch. What falls teaches you more than what blooms." Concubines filed out in silence beneath the wide skies, their wooden geta softly tapping the stone paths. The younger women walked 2 by 2, lips painted like yume petals, faces powdered moon pale. Behind them, the older women, some long past the days of favour, walked more freely, more slowly. They whispered stories of past springs, half mocking, half sincere. From the veranda overlooking the koi pond, a senior lady reclined against crimson cushions. She watched the petals fall like regrets. Every woman here knew. The cherry blossom was both fortune as warning. To be chosen once was joy. To remain unchosen thereafter, quiet grief, wrapped in silken beauty. One girl, Iori, barely 17, had been seen near the Shogun's garden wing earlier that week. Rumours bloomed around her faster than the trees. She stood now beneath a bough heavy with blossoms, her eyes lowered, cheeks warm not from the sun, but from 50 watching eyes. The petals fell, and still she did not move. A court musician plucked the strings of a koto from the shadows near the water's edge. The sound threaded through the garden like silk, soft, longing, weightless. A slow drum echoed in the distance, keeping time not for dance but for breath. In the Uku, even cherry blossom spoke politics. Their falling marked the shifting tides of attention, of favour, of age. The blossoms whispered, "No beauty remains untouched by time, no power untouched by silence." At the far end of the garden, an ancient tree bent under the weight of its own bloom. Beneath it, an older concubine, long since retired into the quieter duties of hosting seasonal rites, recited softly from memory, "The blossom falls, not from shame, but from knowing all things fall. Somewhere beyond the gates, the Shogun conducted matters of state, but here, in this quiet world of perfumes, poems, and silk, the real governance was internal. Every gesture, every blink, every tilt of a fan was laden with meanings only those born to listen could hear." Airy, standing still beneath the blooms, blinked once. Another petal fell, and she smiled, barely. Some victories in the uku came not through seduction nor beauty, but through stillness, through understanding the rhythm of impermanence. At sunset the women returned indoors, their slippers damp from dew, their hair fragrant with plum oil and spring. In the lantern-lit corridors one girl whispered to another, "Next year we may not be here to see them bloom." The other girl nodded, pressing her fingers against a folded Tanzaku poem tucked in her sleeve, a line of basho written in her own hand. "Among the blossoms, even the silence speaks, like old friends parting." In the soft hush after the cherry blossom viewing, let us pause and listen, not to the sounds of the garden, but to the feeling beneath them. The Japanese concept of mono no aware cannot be easily translated. It is not quite sadness, not simply beauty. It is the tender sorrow of impermanence, a quiet ache in the chest when one watches a blossom fall knowing it must. It is the knowledge that all things, laughter, youth, favour, even spring itself, pass. In the uku, this feeling was lived daily. A concubine's beauty, however radiant, dimmed with time. Attention flickered like candlelight, and yet the women cultivated grace not despite this fact, but because of it. Poetry was written with disappearing ink. Hair was adorned with real petals meant to brown and curl by evening's end. The cherry blossom, most celebrated of all flowers, did not last long. That was the point. It was loved more for its vanishing, a mirror to the life of those within the palace walls. Mono no aware is not a sadness to be escaped. It is a sadness to be honoured, and in the silence between the falling of petals, it waits. They say she appeared one spring and was gone by summer. The tale is told in hushed voices, often after the third cup of sake during festivals, of a concubine named Ume, whose name meant plum blossom, though she arrived in the season of Sakura. Umi was said to be unlike the others, not for beauty but for the way she spoke. Her voice was so gentle, it was said, it lulled the maids into stillness, even the koi in the pond to pause. She never sought favour. She smiled too little, and her gaze often lingered, not on the Shogun, but on the cherry trees that bent outside her chamber window. One evening, during the final bloom, the petals fell with unusual heaviness. Some said it snowed blossoms. The next morning Yuma was gone. Her robes were still folded. Her kanzashi hairpin lay across her pillow. The only thing left was a short poem written on rice paper. I did not come to stay, only to watch the petals fall as the moon watched me. Some say she was taken by the kami. Others whisper she was a spirit all along, a ghost born of impermanence. But those who worked in the uku knew better. She had understood, and so she vanished. Later that night, in a quiet corner of the women's quarters, an aging concubine who had not been called upon in many seasons sat brushing her long silvering hair. She murmured softly to herself, not a poem, but a memory. The first year I came, I thought the cherry blossoms were a gift. The second, I realized they were a warning. The third, I wept beneath them. Now I only watch, because they fall the same way each time, and yet each time feels different. She dipped her brush into ink, and in a delicate hand wrote one line onto the paper beside her mirror. All things end as they began, with silence and petals. She blew out the lamp, while the people of Edo crowded along the Sumida River with sake cups in hand and song on their lips. The women of the Uku celebrated Hanami differently. Within the cloistered garden, they walked in silence beneath blooming sakura, each step deliberate, their sleeves brushed against each other like whispers. There was no shouting, no children running, no drunken laughter. Only the wind's hush and the scent of fleeting things. They made offerings of rice cakes coloured like spring, pale pink for the cherry, soft green for new growth, white for farewell to snow. In one corner a young concubine placed a single blossom on the shrine of Benton, goddess of beauty, music and words. She did not speak aloud, but if one leaned close one might have heard the blossom itself murmur, "May I be seen before I am gone." Among the older attendants there was a superstition rarely shared with the younger concubines, how the first falling petal foretold your year. If the first blossom fell upon your shoulder, joy would visit soon. If it landed in your lap, you would be summoned by someone of power. But if it landed in your hair, that year love would become sorrow. Some whispered that a senior lady once shaved her head after the petals touched her hair 3 springs in a row. Others said no one had seen her since. And still, every year, they sat beneath the trees and waited. The sound of a sliding door, paper thin and silence thick, could carry more meaning than any sentence. In the Uku, the women learned to read space as if it were scripture, who turned away, who lingered too long, whose fingers trembled at the teacup. The language of danger was written in perfumed hairpins and lowered eyes. It was not war in the traditional sense. There were no swords, no shouted commands, but power was currency, and favour was rare, and jealousy ever present. It began with a missing comb. Then a red lacquer box turned up cracked. One of the shogun's favoured women found her ceremonial kimono soiled with ink. No one spoke aloud, but faces turned. Conversation stopped when a particular attendant entered the room. By the next week, she had vanished. No punishment was ever announced, no record kept. But her futon was quietly removed before morning prayers. The highest-ranking concubine, Lady Hanayo, was known for her grace, but her sharpest weapon was not her words. It was the ornamental kanzashi she wore, always tilted slightly forward, glinting gold beneath the lanterns. It was said that when she placed her hand upon it mid-conversation, someone would fall from favour before the week ended. She never raised her voice. But once, after a junior consort offered the shogun a poem too soon, after Hanayo's own performance, the younger woman was transferred to the kitchen staff, an unspoken demotion wrapped in polite phrases. She seeks more humble wisdom, they said, but everyone knew it was exile with perfume on top. They called it the whisper game, though no one dared name it out loud. You would hear a phrase in the bathhouse, or see someone write something odd in a scroll and burn it. You might catch a glance too long, or a back turn too quickly. And soon, that phrase was in the lips of 6 more. By the next night, someone was crying behind a folding screen. Not all rumours were true, but they all had power. Folded inside the sleeve of a sleeping matron was a piece of silk, cream white, embroidered with a red spider. No name, no ink, just the symbol. To the right person it meant, "Watch your steps, you are seen." The woman didn't sleep that night, and by morning, her daily tea ceremony had been passed to another. Some believe she fled the compound by pretending illness. Others said her breath slowed unnaturally one night and never resumed. But the spider silk remained, sealed now in a hidden drawer, waiting. At dusk, the lanterns glowed amber along the covered walkway. Shadows stretched like long fingers. Two concubines sat opposite each other, heads bowed, sipping warm sake in silence. Each had heard the same rumour about a missing letter, about a servant's betrayal, about a new favourite who might rise too fast. But neither spoke, because in the uku, words were footsteps on ice, and silence was the only place one might safely hide. In a far corner of the uku, behind a sliding panel rarely opened, there was a bronze mirror kept beneath a silk cloth. It was said to have belonged to a concubine named Yukako, whose beauty rivaled the cherry blossoms, and whose ambition, some whispered, reached far past her station. Yukako had written poems that charmed the shogun, and songs that made even the old women blush, but she was known also for staring too long into mirrors, as if they might answer her. One evening she gifted the shogun a poem folded into the sleeve of her own mirror. By morning the mirror had been returned to her, cracked straight down the centre. A broken gaze reflects too much, someone had scrawled in ink beside her futon. By week's end, Yukako was gone. The mirror remained. Some say her spirit lingers in its reflection, only glimpsed when the veil slips just so, showing a face that isn't yours. And since that day, no one looks too long into it. Within the uku, formal punishments were rarely seen, but their presence was felt constantly. Though it appeared to be a world of soft lanterns, quiet slippers, and perfumed letters, the hierarchy was reinforced by subtle terror. Demotion, the most common form of discipline. A woman could be reassigned from the pleasure quarters to latrine duty, without ceremony or explanation. Isolation, a small room near the back of the complex where an offender might be confined for days. No writing implements, no visitors, only silence and the ticking of incense clocks. Exile, sometimes disguised as a transfer. This meant being moved out of the uku entirely, perhaps to a shrine, or into service in a remote household. Often they were never heard from again. Disgrace through dress, the most symbolic punishment. A woman once caught smuggling a forbidden charm was made to wear plain robes without colour for an entire season, the equivalent of public humiliation in a world built on appearance. Not all punishments were official. Many were quietly orchestrated by higher-ranking women, whose power operated through suggestion and ritualized exclusion. Even the mere fear of suspicion could unravel someone's standing. In a community where status was everything, invisibility was worse than pain. In the world beyond the red-lacquered gates of Edo Castle, punishment was often swift and public. Thieves lost hands, rebels lost heads. But within the secluded chambers of the uku, where men were absent and words were currency, punishment took on subtler forms, forms that whispered, that lingered, and that reshaped a woman from the inside out. To live in the uku was to breathe in rules, some written, most not, and every rule carried the weight of being watched. There were no beatings in public squares, no shouting magistrates, no iron bars. Instead, there were rituals, acts of unmaking designed not to harm the body but to erase one's identity, to dissolve one's reflection. A woman might lose her courtyard name, the poetic title given to her upon elevation. Autumn reed, night willow, moon branch. These were not mere ornaments but social armour. To lose it was to become nameless, voiceless. Servants would stop bowing. Peers would turn their faces slightly away. It was a quiet drowning. Another form, the inkless scroll, a punishment both symbolic and suffocating. A concubine found guilty of gossip, seduction outside rank, or harbouring superstitions might be ordered to copy sutras, using only water and a brush. By the time the scroll dried, the text would vanish. Days of work, gone, a ritual in futility. It was believed this taught humility, but also revealed a deep Confucian belief that even invisible devotion mattered to the gods, or perhaps that the self too was impermanent. Food, too, could become a tool. A woman under suspicion might receive a different tea, bitter, astringent, served without sweet rice crackers, or her lacquerware might be swapped for plain ceramic, a spoon missing, chopsticks of ash wood instead of cherry. These were not errors, they were messages. She had fallen from favour, and everyone knew. In rare cases, those deemed too ambitious, or who had dishonoured the rituals of restraint, were reassigned to distant chambers at the edge of the uku, sometimes called the shadow halls. Cold in winter, too quiet in spring. These rooms faced north, their tatami often damp, their view a mossed stone wall. Here, no drums sounded at festival time. Here, the seasons came and went without song. Some women remained there for years, still technically members of the shogun's household, but spoken of as if already dead. The mornings began before the light reached the paper screens. Soft tapping at the door, a rustle of layered silk robes, a shallow bow. Before she even opened her eyes, she knew her body must already be still. The spine straight, breath soft, the face a mirror of poise. This was not taught in a single day. Obedience was not an act. It was a posture carried through every moment of one's waking and sleeping life. In the world beyond the walls, obedience was often loud. Shouted commands, gestures of subservience, forced genuflection. But here, within the uku, it was quiet, internal, and exquisitely rehearsed. Young women brought into the palace before they turned 16 were trained not merely to behave, but to feel in line with expectation. Emotions were petals to be folded inward. Modesty was not clothing, it was breath. To speak less than needed, to bow with a perfect distance between elbows and ribs, to avoid laughing too brightly or weeping too soon. During morning instruction, they recited from the Honor Daigaku, the greater learning for women, not as schoolgirls, but as vessels of idealized femininity. These chants were half mantra, half prayer. Obey your Lord as you would the mountain. Speak gently, move gently, feel with restraint. Let your face show serenity, your heart remain like the still pond. These verses did not merely regulate behaviour, they formed the scaffolding of the self. One of the most common tools of etiquette in the uku was the fan. More than ornament, it was a device of control. An open fan was a signal of conversation, invitation, or laughter. A closed fan, silence, restraint, reflection. Every concubine carried one, often plain, sometimes decorated with discreet poems or faded chrysanthemums, but always folded when in the presence of authority. To close the fan without looking down was a test of grace. To place it beside one's left hand when seated was a sign of submission. The flutter of a fan, too quick or too bold, could mark a woman as impetuous, or worse, ambitious. Whispers spoke of one senior lady who had her fan taken from her, never to receive another. It was said her hands trembled for days, unable to rest. Silence, in the uku, was as expressive as poetry. A woman's refusal to speak could be a performance, 1,000 meanings in the space between words. When summoned before the Joro or Toshiori, the senior matron, junior attendants were expected to answer with 3 levels of silence. The first silence in reverence, the second silence in thought, the third silence in obedience. Only then a response, clipped, slow, never louder than the rain on the roof tiles. To excel at silence was to rise. To break it, through gossip, complaint, or unsanctioned laughter, could undo months of reputation. In the quietest hours of the night, when the lamps were dimmed and only the night incense remained, some women trained themselves even in sleep. They practiced still sleeping, an art passed down from senior concubines who claimed the shogun preferred not only calm minds, but bodies that never tossed or turned. A woman would lie on her side, hands folded, one leg delicately bent as if sculpted. They said such posture shaped not only the body but the dreams themselves. In dreams, they said, the disobedient heart revealed itself. Within the uku, it was whispered that the most refined women were not just still in the waking world, but in sleep as well. There was a private chamber, scarcely spoken of, its paper walls lacquered in black and dusted with silver ink, known as the Room of Sleeping Flowers. Here, certain women were trained by an elder court attendant in the discipline of dreamcraft. Not magic, not superstition, but a cultivated belief that one's posture in sleep could guide the soul. To drift off with the arms curled just so, to keep the breath measured and face calm, was said to shape the dreams that followed. Dreams without disturbance, without betrayal. For in this world, even dreams could be dangerous. The shogun favours the serene, one elder once said. Let your mind be a garden swept before moonrise. Women would wake in silence, sit with knees folded, and sip bitter tea made from dried lotus root and powdered plum. It was believed to cleanse the spirit of unruly emotions. One scroll from the Edo period described this practice in coded poetry. I sleep without shadow, I dream without edge. My soul tied in silk, my breath like snow on moss. In the uku, emotion was a private prayer, not to be seen, not to be heard. To be overcome by sadness or joy in public was a sign of spiritual imbalance. The concubines were taught to treat feelings not as enemies to be slain, but as unruly spirits to be gently confined. Through slow movements, subtle breathwork, and focused gaze training, a woman could master her inner world. One exercise involved holding a single plum blossom in the hand, observing it silently for several minutes each morning. This meditation was meant to soften the heart, but also train the gaze to remain steady under any strain. Each emotion was paired with a counter-element in training. Anger was calmed by still water. Longing was softened by lavender smoke. Jealousy was smoothed by brush strokes and calligraphy. Grief was wrapped in ritual, a folded kimono, refolded until peace returned. One tale told of a concubine who, after hearing of a friend's punishment, spent 3 days in ritual silence, communicating only through the arrangement of dried herbs on her writing table. She earned not only respect but quiet power. There is a moment, between when the fan opens and when it closes, where all breath in the chamber stills. This was known in the uku as the moment of judgment. Not formal judgment, but a subtler kind. A moment where a glance might seal a fate, where a smile might save a reputation, and where stillness itself became a kind of invisible shield. Concubines were trained not only in the movement of the body, but in the ritual choreography of absence, knowing when not to speak, when to lower the eyes but not too far, when to turn one's fan just enough to suggest a message without revealing the face behind it. An elder once whispered, "We speak in folds, in silks and shadows. A loud voice is a cracked bowl. A loud heart is a broken comb." These lessons were not written down. They were passed in gesture, in years of imitation, in quiet corrections. A fingertip resting on a wrist, a hand slightly guiding an elbow inward. To break decorum was not merely to err in etiquette, it was to disrupt the sacred balance of the uku, an offence not easily forgotten. It was said the best women of the inner chambers could walk through a room filled with suspicion, rivalry, and hunger for power, and leave no trace behind, like a cloud passing through painted silk. There were rumours of a woman known only as Kozakura, Cherry Petal, who never spoke above a whisper. Yet the moment she entered a room, others quieted. No one ever saw her punished, but no one saw her rise either. Some believed she was a ghost, the perfected embodiment of obedience so refined she had transcended. The hush that followed the news did not arrive all at once. It settled in layers, like silk folded across a sleeping child. She felt it before the others spoke it. A strange lightness, the unmooring of a world gently tilting on its axis. Attendants, too trained to show surprise, moved in more careful circles. The physician's eyes did not meet hers for long, and later, when the Lady Superior placed her hand on the girl's shoulder in the Hall of Lamps, it was not with reprimand, but reverence. The Shogun's seed had taken root. The concubine had become more than a vessel of refinement or pleasure. She was now a bearer of legacy, a gate through which a possible heir might emerge. In the unseen registers of courtly hierarchy, her name inked itself higher, her presence now tinged with something divine. Pregnancy in the Uku was both exaltation and captivity. Her chambers changed. Gone were the plum and vermilion shades of seduction, replaced with calm creams and sky greys. Perfumes were removed, salt was scattered. Her meals arrived in bowls carved with the phases of the moon, her attendants replaced with elder women trained in care and secrecy. She dreamed differently, no longer of dance or favour, but of cranes crossing fog, of distant bells beneath water, of a child with the Shogun's eyes who said nothing and only watched. In the evenings she was bathed in silence, cloth dipped in warm chrysanthemum tea, wiped across her belly as incantations were murmured not for her but for what stirred within. Outside, cherry blossoms fell in slow spirals. Within, time folded. Whispers threaded through the halls. Would it be a boy? Would the Shogun's astrologer approve of the star under which it was conceived? Would the child live long enough to shift alliances? A child changed everything. For some, it meant power. For others, demotion. If she bore a son, she might one day be mother to a future ruler. If she bore a daughter, the silk of celebration would soften but not brighten. And if she lost it, the shift would reverse. Her fortune would unravel like a scroll left in rain. The same faces that now bowed might turn away. The same hands that fed her tea might no longer come. But in this in-between she was untouchable, sacred, suspended. She began writing poems again, short ones, just 3 lines at a time, like cracked shells of longer thoughts. Swallow on the sill. Does it know it guards a throne, or only the light? She spoke more gently, walked more slowly, felt the ground, the tatami, the grain of wood underfoot as though rediscovering them. She began to sing, to herself, to the child, to the unseen spirits that brushed the ink of fate behind closed doors, lullabies that came from old nurses, from doorframe scribbles, from half-remembered songs heard during her first year in the Uku. In those nights, the air was filled with murmurs, not of politics, but of breath. The inhale and exhale of 1,000 women waiting, watching, whispering. Outside, somewhere, the Shogun sat in his own silence. In the cloistered world of Edo period Japan, the bearing of a child for the Shogun was a sacred passage, one that blurred the lines between woman and symbol, body and nation. Women who bore the ruler's children were elevated in name, rank, and legacy. Sometimes quietly, sometimes with thunderous consequence. A concubine who gave birth to a healthy son could rise above even the highest-ranking courtesan, occasionally rivaling the political sway of daimyo families. But the ascent was never guaranteed. Much depended on the alliances around her, the mood of the Shogun, the omens of the stars, and the quiet influence of the women who had waited longer. Birth was not simply a domestic matter. It was a political event, and in its ceremony, ancient echoes stirred. In the Uku, certain rites traced their roots to Shinto and Buddhist traditions. Sanba, midwives trained in esoteric cleanliness rituals, would cleanse not only the birthing room, but the spiritual path the child was said to cross on its descent from the unseen world. Salt lines were drawn. Tiny bells were hung at thresholds to ward off wayward spirits. Women wore charms of Jizo, guardian of children, near their heart. Some whispered sutras from the Canon Sutra, invoking the Bodhisattva of compassion, protector of mothers. And always there was silence. No screaming, no weeping, only clenched teeth and the slow counting of breaths. To suffer in quiet was a mark of grace. To cry too loudly could be seen as inviting misfortune. If a son was born, his tiny body was washed with sakura water, petal infused, and swaddled in white cloth to mimic a spirit's first robe. His naming was postponed, as tradition held that the first days belonged not to the living world but to the world between. Daughters, though not without their own ceremony, were received with gentler celebration. They too carried strategic value, marriageable gifts in a world of alliances, but rarely did they threaten the inner balance of the Uku with the same seismic weight as a sun. Legends told of ghostly births, concubines who carried children touched by fox spirits or born under eclipsed moons. One tale, often murmured with more smile than belief, told of a child born with hair shaped like the crest of the Tokugawa clan, who was said to be destined to dream of past lives as emperors and carp. Such stories were less about truth and more about meaning. In the Uku, every birth was a ripple in a pond still watched by hundreds of eyes. Sometimes the women who gave birth to Shogun's children disappeared, not in death, but in quiet retirement, sent to temples, remote villas, or small inner courts where they would live in spiritual seclusion. Not as punishment, but as preservation. In some rare cases, a mother would rise in prominence, consulted on matters of ritual or protocol, her wisdom revered like a seasonal oracle, but just as often her purpose fulfilled, she would fade into the lacquered silence of memory. Birth, in the palatial depths of Edo Castle, was never just a beginning. It was a cipher, a moment that echoed forward into politics, backward into myth, and inward toward the quiet grief and grace of women who shaped empires in whispers and carried futures in their bodies. In Edo, Japan, the birth of a child within the Uku was not merely personal. It was profoundly political and spiritual. When a concubine conceived, layers of ritual were enacted to ensure not only a healthy child, but a future in harmony with the stars and ancestral spirits. She was moved to a more secluded, protected wing, often under the supervision of elder matrons and midwives steeped in traditional herbalism and esoteric customs. The room was hung with charms against malevolent spirits, and rice paper amulets were placed above the doorways, invoking kami such as Koyasu-sama, the protector of safe childbirth. Ancient rites whispered back to a time before feudal rule, when fertility was honoured in Shinto shrines with offerings of cloth, paper cranes, and rice. At night, women would murmur poems to the unborn child, lines of waka wrapped in breath, carried like lullabies to ears not yet opened. Should the child be born male, especially under auspicious omens, cherry blossoms blooming out of season, or a crescent moon reflected just so in the birth water, it was said to signal destiny. The hierarchy would shift. The mother's name whispered more boldly in the hallways. Gifts from the Shogun himself, perhaps a single brushstroke of acknowledgement, could change her fate forever. But shadows lingered. The child of a concubine could be hidden, guarded, or quietly forgotten depending on court politics. Some were raised within the walls. Others were sent to be educated in temples or hidden homes. The future was not always safe, even for those born beneath the lantern's glow. In older myths still remembered within the folds of the Uku, women who bore children to gods or emperors often suffered transformation. One such tale, passed secretly among attendants, was of a noblewoman said to have borne a child to a kami of the mountain mist. Her skin turned pale as snow, her eyes clouded silver. She sang her child into the world with a voice that sounded like wind through bamboo. When the child was born, he vanished into the fog and became a fox who guarded travellers lost on narrow roads. These myths blurred the line between history and imagination, but they offered a private thread of meaning to women locked in roles not of their own choosing. To carry a child was not only service to power, but an echo of ancient stories. It placed a woman between two worlds, one of flesh and ritual, and another of fate and transformation. Some believed that if a mother wept over her infant's first cry, the gods would mark the child with a unique path. Others whispered that dreams during pregnancy, of cranes, of tides, of broken mirrors, could reveal the shape of a soul before it opened its eyes. In this way, even the constrained lives of Uku women were stitched with cosmic weight, bound not only to hierarchy, but to myth. The room where the child would be born was not like others. It was small, but elegantly appointed, papered in soft cream tones and lined with cedar. Tiny bells hung near the threshold, their chimes quiet enough not to disturb, but ever present, as if to remind all who entered that something sacred stirred within. A brazier glowed faintly in the corner. Low firelight danced across lacquered panels depicting cranes in flight. Their wings stretched eternally across seasons. The faint scent of camellia oil hung in the air, and beside the mat where the mother lay, a silk cloth was embroidered with motifs of pine and plum, symbols of perseverance and renewal. Women of the inner circle gathered in turns, their footsteps muffled, their hands folded. Some carried scrolls of sutras to recite quietly near the doorway. Others brought bundles of herbs, angelica root, mugwort, ginger, steeped into hot water to ease pain, to bring clarity, to settle dreams. Outside, the garden remained shadowed by moonlight. Carp shifted slowly beneath the pond's surface, and a lantern left just beyond the paper wall flickered as if moved by an unseen breath. They will take him from me, won't they? The thought comes not with fear, but resignation. She runs her hand slowly over her belly, feeling the firmness of life growing within. He will belong to the Shogun, to the clan, to a name, but for a few short days, perhaps, he will belong to me. She closes her eyes, trying to remember the lullaby her own mother sang, now blurred by time. She hums it softly. It doesn't matter if the words are wrong. The rhythm is the same. The love is the same. Outside, a snowflake lands on the edge of the veranda. Another follows. Quietly, the world begins to whiten. Whispers stir beyond the walls like wind behind a screen. She has been chosen, one attendant says, lowering her gaze. She carries power now, another murmurs. Power wrapped in silk and silence. The older women smile faintly, knowingly. They've seen this shift before. Not every woman survives it, but those who do become something different. Not wives, not consorts. Something more mythic, more dangerous. Her food is tasted 3 times before reaching her. Her baths are drawn in sacred water. When she walks, others bow more deeply. But she cannot leave. She's both revered and enclosed. The vessel of legacy, watched by all. The child is not simply an heir. He's a knot in the grand weave of lineage, an echo of past generations folded into the silk of the present. In palace beliefs, one did not only inherit blood, but memory, shadows of ancestors carried through mannerism, gaze, and even birthmarks. A child born under the full moon might be said to carry the clarity of a former daimyo's judgment. One born during a storm might be blessed with fire, or cursed with turmoil. The midwives studied such signs with grave reverence. Some claimed to see the future in the direction the child first turned its head. North, a wanderer. East, a scholar. West, a sorrow. South, a ruler. The bamboo creaked gently in the night wind, each stalk like an old voice remembering. From where she sat, just beneath the overhang of the eaves, the concubine could see the koi pond, its waters silvered by moonlight. The fish moved slowly, stirring soft ripples that kissed the stones and vanished. She no longer adorned her hair with bells or combs. Now it was bound in quiet folds, held only with a pin carved from aged plumwood. Her robes, once layered in showy silks, had given way to soft hemp dyed with the hush of indigo. It was a quiet dignity, a presence that no longer needed to speak to be noticed. "I used to stand there," she whispered, pointing to the corner of the courtyard where a flowering camellia leaned. "We would wait for his passing glance as though it were sunlight, and we were just paper flowers." A younger woman knelt beside her, a newly arrived attendant, eager but gentle. She listened, offering no questions, only presence. The elder continued, voice soft, the words seeming to float rather than fall. "The palace does not forget, but it does blur. Moments get folded into one another, like layers of silk. There are smiles I remember vividly, and names I do not." She smiled faintly, lifting a porcelain cup of green tea to her lips. It trembled just slightly. From within the garden, a frog chirped. "Do not mistake survival for victory," she murmured to the younger woman. "We bloom here in cages, trained to smile even when our roots cannot stretch. But there is a beauty in restraint too, a poetry in quiet endurance." In the stillness, she recited a short poem once passed to her by a chamber poet. "Beneath the quiet moon, my breath, a drifting lantern, no longer seeking." The attendant bowed deeply. There had been a girl once, with a sharp tongue and quick hands. Her friend, her rival, her mirror. They had grown together behind sliding doors and gossamer screens. But one day the girl was simply gone. No word, no ceremony, just a vacant space where laughter had lived. "She chose the wrong words at the wrong time," the elder whispered. "That is all it takes here. A glance, a rumour, a sigh." And then she paused. "But I still dream of her. Sometimes I think, she's freer than I ever was." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of plum blossoms across the courtyard. Lanterns swayed, their light dimming one by one like thoughts slipping away. The elder stood slowly, her bones whispering their protests. The younger girl moved to help, but the gesture was met with a slow, graceful hand. "I can still walk," the old concubine said, smiling. "Not far, but far enough to reach the edge of memory." She walked toward the corridors where shadows lengthened and silence grew. Some gardens we only enter in memory. Others are never meant to be reached at all. An elder's reflection on aging in the Yuku. They say that in Kyoto there is a tea house that never discards broken cups. Instead, they practice kintsugi, the art of mending with gold. A crack is not shameful there, but sacred. A fracture becomes part of the cup story, glinting with purpose. So too, within the Yuku, some women endure long enough to be gilded by time. They are not cast aside, not always. They become keepers of unspoken traditions, guides through the unwritten corridors of emotional restraint. One elder concubine, who had not been seen by the Shogun in decades, was said to be able to read a woman's fate by the way she held her fan. "Tension in the wrist," she'd whisper, "means ambition. Looseness means grief." Her chambers were visited in secret, not by lovers, but by those hungry for perspective. She would serve tea carefully, the handle of the pot worn smooth by age and grace. "Learn this," she once said, "when the bloom fades, scent remains. And when that too is gone, silence is the last perfume." There was a small, almost forgotten grove at the rear of the inner palace, where old willows bent toward a stone path few used. It was not part of any formal garden. Some said it had been planted before the current shogun's father had even taken power. It was a place only older women seemed to find, drawn like fish to a familiar current. One night, as the moon slipped behind drifting clouds, two women met there, one silver-haired, one just beginning to show her age. They did not speak of men, not of power or rank or poetry. They spoke of aches in the knee, of dreams of children never born, of the odd peace that came when ambition finally departed. "The younger ones think we are ghosts," one said, smiling into the dark. "Perhaps we are," said the other, "but ghosts who remember the sound of their own name." They sat together until the moon returned, hanging like a paper lantern above the leaves. Buried in the quieter wing of the inner palace was a narrow room lined entirely with aged silvered mirrors. No one cleaned them. No one admitted going there. But every woman eventually did. A tale passed in hushed tones claimed that the room had once been used in beauty training, that a concubine had to gaze into her own reflection and recite her poetry aloud until she no longer faltered, until her mask became her skin. But now, the room was a sanctuary of another kind. Older women went there not to perform but to remember. The glass no longer flattered, it distorted. It reflected not the body, but the weight of years behind the eyes. One record from an anonymous diary reads, "I went today. I saw the version of myself who never left her province. She smiled at me. I wept quietly without shame." They say that beneath the palace floors lies a single red thread, buried during the first days of the Uku, meant to tie the fate of every woman who lived within its walls, invisible to the eye, but felt in dreams. Some whispered that if you stood in the far eastern corridor just before dawn and removed your sandals, you could feel it, like the hum of silk pulling gently across the skin of the earth. An older woman once said, "When I miscarried, I walked that hall for days. I could not find the thread. But when I began to sing again months later, I felt it move underfoot, as if it remembered me." Even in age, some concubines claimed that if they told the truth aloud, not to others, but to themselves, the thread would respond. Not with sound, but with warmth in the soles of the feet. In a lacquered box, hidden behind a loose panel of an ancient screen, lies a folded letter, never opened, never sent. Written in the finest calligraphy, on rice paper pressed with plum blossom ghosts, it bears no name, no seal, only this: to the girl I was. You held so many dreams you were too polite to chase. You spoke with grace when your bones wanted to scream. You believed you would be loved for your silence, but it was not silence they loved, only the shape it made around them. Still, you were beautiful, even when you bowed too low, even when you were forgotten. The handwriting is steady, old, and elegant. Some say it belonged to a senior concubine who vanished one winter's day without fanfare. Others claim it appears differently to each who finds it, as if the letter rewrites itself to fit the soul of the reader. When the letter is returned to its box, something in the room feels lighter, a breeze through bamboo, a hush of understanding, as if every whispered regret in the uku had been heard and held for just a moment. The corridors are quieter now. The lacquered floors no longer echo with silk-footed rivals or the faint chiming laughter of the younger ones. Lanterns hang still, their light dimmed by time and dust. In the once vibrant inner court, where fans once fluttered like butterflies and secrets bloomed in shaded corners, only the rustle of wind through bamboo marks the hour. She is older now. Her hair, once dressed high and gleaming with oil, is threaded with silver. The folds of her robe are heavier, the patterns of cranes and pines faded by the gentle erasure of decades. And her hands, the same that once performed dances before the Shogun, once offered incense with trembling elegance, now rest folded in her lap, calm and quiet. Outside the palace walls the world turns. She hears whispers from the outer court of new ways, of foreign ships in distant harbours, of a world beyond Edo beginning to pulse with unfamiliar rhythms. The gates of the uku, once the boundary of all she knew, are no longer as sealed, but within her a stillness remains. She rises early now before the light and walks through the garden she once only glimpsed in youth. The koi still circle in lazy spirals beneath the surface. The plum tree still flowers, only now she does not rush to catch its petals in her sleeve. She lets them fall. In the mornings, she listens for the temple bell. It does not ring often, not every day, but when it does, it tolls like a breath held for years, deep, measured, final. She remembers each chapter of her life in the uku not by years or seasons, but by sounds. The snap of a fan in anger, the soft thud of kneeling, the rustle of silks in the night, the shogun's voice like a wind behind a screen, the cries of a newborn, the hush of a punishment delivered just beyond the eye's reach. Now, those sounds are memories. She passes the place where she once carved a name, not her own, into the underside of a wooden beam. The name has faded, but the act remains, a gesture of quiet rebellion, or love, or fear. She no longer remembers, but she smiles. Because she has learned that memory too is a kind of garden. Things grow, and some things must be let go. Tonight, as the bell rings once more, low and full against the dawn, she folds her robe carefully and lies upon her mat. Not in fear, not in longing, but in acceptance. The curtain has not yet fallen, but it sways gently now. A final breath, a final thought. Was I seen? And then silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but of completeness. Of a life lived entirely within the folds of silk and secrecy, now settling into stillness. In the still hours, when the palace lay dormant, some say the walls themselves began to whisper. Paper thin, the shoji screens absorbed everything. Laughter, secrets, arguments never spoken aloud. These walls had listened longer than any concubine, held tighter to truth than any retainer. They remembered each name, each night, each fading perfume. Sometimes an old woman resting against one would close her eyes and swear she heard her younger self giggling through the partition, stealing a glance, a secret, a dream. But the wall never told. It only held the weight of memory. At the heart of the garden, the reflection pool rarely stirred. Its surface, still as glass, had seen the faces of hundreds of women, hopeful, terrified, radiant, angry, weary. A legend passed among the younger women, that on the right night, when the moon was full and the pool mirrored it perfectly, one could see the faces of those who came before. The bold ones stared long, the wise ones bowed and passed by, and the oldest. They smiled and whispered, "I saw her once. She looked just like me." In the record books of the court, names were rarely real. Each woman received a court title, flower-like, elegant, symbolic. Their true names were left behind at the gate, folded up like a garment no longer worn, but in dreams that name often returned. Sometimes, a concubine would write her real name in the condensation of a bathhouse mirror, or whisper it into the sleeve of a kimono, or murmur it to the wind before releasing a caged bird, not to be remembered by others, but to remember herself. When all was said and done, what remained? A life of beauty, yes, of discipline, secrecy, poise, of silken movements and ink-stained fingers, of obeying and watching, of blooming and fading in rhythm with the seasons, a life hidden from history's eyes, yet lived fully in the corners of candlelight. She had walked a path few knew existed, let alone understood. And though her voice was never raised in the annals of power, it shaped the tone of a palace. Her smile, her restraint, her choice not to speak. These were politics of a subtler kind. She had once thought her story would disappear like smoke, but now she understood. Her life was a lantern, perhaps not bright, but steady. And many lanterns together light even the thickest fog. At the back of the lacquered chamber, behind silken curtains and carved chests, was a small cabinet lined with rows of porcelain flasks. Each held a fragrance for a season, a mood, a ritual. Plum blossom for spring dances, sandalwood for meditation, clove and musk for nights of favour, and one, sealed with gold wax never opened, saved for the afterlife. In her final years, she would open the lids one by one, inhaling the ghosts of younger selves. A scent could carry her across decades faster than any tale. And when she left the uku, the last thing she packed was a slip of cloth scented with the unopened vial, her true memory. Each morning and night a bell was struck in the inner court, not to announce time but to signal transitions, meditation, meals, prayers, silence. One of the concubines had taken to counting the bells. By her final winter she believed she'd heard it over 20,000 times. She had written no memoirs, left no painted scrolls. But she knew this. She had lived a life that fit between chimes. Not always peaceful, not always joyful, but fully hers, marked in resonance. The smallest things often visited her in those final days. A sparrow that returned again and again to her paper window, tapping gently with its beak, as if reminding her that the world beyond still fluttered and moved. She once whispered to it, "You have wings, and still you come back." The bird tilted its head. In that moment she understood. Even the free sometimes long for the familiar. Some concubines had vanished from memory, even in their own time. Some were quietly dismissed. Some died too young. Others simply faded into anonymity. But among the oldest women, there was a secret ritual. Once a year, during the chrysanthemum bloom, they whispered the forgotten names aloud. Names not written in records, not carved into wood. Names remembered only by the breath that spoke them. This too was legacy, to speak aloud what the world forgot. When she was very young, she had folded a paper crane from a torn piece of discarded poetry. She didn't remember why she'd kept it, or how it had survived so many seasons, but on her last morning in the court she found it tucked inside an old fan. Frayed, faded, its wings still folded perfectly. She smiled. It had lasted. Quietly, like her. She held it to her heart, and for a brief moment she believed she could still fly. In a covered alcove of the inner court sat an old bronze mirror, veined with age, its surface dulled by time. For decades she had avoided it. Too many faces it had shown her. The hopeful girl, the adorned woman, the sleepless mother, the mournful friend. But in her twilight years she found herself drawn to it again. She would sit before it in silence, not to check her hair or ornaments, but to greet the stillness. "You've seen all of me," she would whisper, "and you stayed." Sometimes that was enough. It was said the tatami mats held memory, pressed flat beneath centuries of sandals, laughter, weeping, and ritual. On certain nights, as the wind crept through the shutters, she imagined she heard voices murmuring from the floor. Not ghosts in the frightening sense, but memories, brushing softly against the edge of sleep. A child's giggle, a warning cough, a prayer begun but never finished. The palace didn't need hauntings. It had memory stitched into its seams. There was one room that no concubine ever used. Not for sleeping, not for studying, not for punishment. No one could recall who it had belonged to, or why it was left untouched. Some said it had once belonged to a woman the Shogun had loved and lost. Others said it had never been used, a space deliberately left empty to remind the others of impermanence. In her final season, she passed by it and paused. She placed a folded poem just inside the door. May nothingness remain as sacred as memory. Each year, on the last night of summer, the women of the inner court would gather in quiet, barefoot and wrapped in plain robes to float small paper lanterns in the palace pond. Each light bore a wish or a sorrow, written in invisible ink. Some years the lanterns caught wind and danced across the water. Some years they sank quickly, like secrets too heavy to carry, but always they disappeared into the dark. She never said what she wrote, but every year she lit one, and every year she watched it go. Behind her sleeping chamber stood an old byobu, a folding screen painted with cranes and pine. When she was young, it was just decoration, a barrier for privacy. But with years, it became a quiet companion. She began to speak to it, not aloud, but with glances, silent questions, shared breath. The cranes never moved. The pine never aged. She once dreamt that the screen unfolded into an open sky, and she stepped into it, featherlight. The next morning she wept, not from sadness but recognition. At the deepest hour of night, when the world was suspended in a hush too deep for dreams, a temple bell would toll in the far-off hills, the fifth watch. Its sound travelled softly through walls and centuries, arriving like a breath at her bedside. When she was younger, she feared it, the coldness, the stillness. But in these late years, it was a comfort, a steady rhythm beneath the drifting clouds of time. She would whisper, "Still here, still listening," and return to sleep. There was a small wooden gate behind the gardens, half overgrown and rarely noticed. No key, no guards, no one remembered when it was last used, but she found it once as a young attendant and pressed her fingers to the warm wood. For years she kept its location in her mind like a spell, a symbol of choice, even if never taken. In her final season she walked there again, this time slower. She did not open it, but she bowed to it and smiled. She wrote a single poem every year and hid each in a small lacquer box beneath her floor mat. No one ever saw them, not even the woman who swept the chamber daily. They were too sacred for ears. They were written in the hand she used only for secrets. Ink faint, brush hesitant. When she turned 70, she burned them all, one by one, with incense, in silence. Words left unread do not fade. They echo without end. There was a chamber known only by scent. It had no windows. Its walls were lined with cedar drawers, each filled with powdered woods, dried blossoms, resin, or shell. Here, women learned to compose a fragrance, not for others, but for the soul. It was said that scent remembered what the mind forgot. She once blended a mixture of amber, iris root, and winter plum. It smelled of longing. She never wore it, only opened the vial when she needed to feel human. The hand mirror she kept was imperfect, the silver worn, the back cracked. When she was a girl, she checked it for beauty. When she was older, she checked it for truth. And in age, she gazed not to see herself, but to vanish into the stillness of reflection, to meet the self without mask, without role. Once she swore she saw her mother's eyes in its dim silver light. The mirror blinked back. On a humid spring night, she began a letter she never meant to send. It was to a child she never bore, but often imagined. My dearest, I don't know your face, but I know your breath. The ink did not dry. The paper curled. The letter never finished. She kept it in her sleeve for years, folded against her pulse. It was enough to know the words existed. In the hour before dawn, the lanterns flickered, casting shadows not quite their own. One morning, she thought she saw a younger version of herself in the glow, laughing, hiding behind a silk screen, brushing ink across a fan. Another time, it was her older self, walking slowly through the gravel path, whispering a poem to a ghost. The lanterns never told which shadow was real. But in that gentle deception, she found peace. There was an old pear tree in the northeast courtyard, so crooked it leaned toward the kitchen wall like it was listening. It never bore fruit, but every spring it flowered with white petals so delicate they fell before the noon sun touched them. She once whispered a name to it, a name only she knew. The tree, she believed, remembered. In that it was more constant than any person she had ever loved. Hair was never just hair. A comb was not just a comb. A pin could be honour, jealousy, a secret passed in code. One girl had carved a poem into the lacquer of her comb, kanji so small they could only be read in candlelight. Another had hidden a blade in her bun for 5 years, never used it. When asked why, she replied, "To remember I could." Some evenings she would finger her own plain pin and wonder what it held. One winter afternoon, long after the pond had frozen over and the sky turned pewter, a pair of red-crowned cranes descended into the courtyard. No one spoke, no one moved. The birds stood there, still as thoughts, until the temple bell rang. Some said it was a sign of rebirth, others claimed it marked a death. She only remembered how their feathers moved like smoke in wind. And that briefly the inner court felt infinite. Every building has one room where silence is heavier than the rest. This room held no instruments, no paper for poems, no cushions to kneel on. It was simply there, an empty breath in the architecture. She went there when she needed to let go of something, but didn't want anyone to see. They said the room remembered what others forgot. Some said it was built for grief. She thought it was built for love that could not speak. The hush that now drapes the inner court is unlike any that came before it. Not the calculated silence of rivalry, nor the reverent stillness before the shogun's approach. It is the silence of age, of the world drawing its breath slowly, with no need to exhale. The paper screens are closed, but not to keep out prying eyes. There are none left. The corridors are lighter now, emptier, shadows where once laughter echoed. Names once whispered are now faded brushstrokes in old letters. Footsteps fall softer, as if not to wake memory. And yet, within these weathered walls, beneath a slant of evening light, she still walks. No longer the favourite, the rival, the mother, the ornament. Simply a soul with years stitched quietly into the hem of her robe. She steps into the once forbidden garden, now hers alone, where the lanterns sway without occasion, and the koi stir lazily in their stone basin. A blossom drifts into the pond, a late bloom with no season left to mark. The bell sounds faintly from the outer temple, not to signal change, but to say, "You have passed through." She sits beside the water, knees folded beneath her, spine upright with that practiced grace that never left her. She breathes once more, deeply, and lets it go. No regrets, only echoes, no audience, only wind, no curtain, only the hush of dawn. And in that hush, a final knowing that though the gates of the uku never opened outward, its story still wandered far, into dreams, into silence, into time itself. As the final bell tolls and the palace gates close on the lives we've whispered about tonight, remember that history is never truly silent. It lingers in the shadows, in forgotten whispers, and in the soft pages of time. The lives of these women, their stories and their world have faded, but they are never truly gone. Thank you for joining me in this quiet exploration of the uku, the shogun's concubines, and the impermanence of all things. If you found peace in their stories tonight, I hope it will carry you into your dreams. Until next time,